Usually when you sit down at a computer and press the power button, there is this fundamental expectation of just immediate, flawless execution.
Right. You just expect it to work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The cooling fan whirs, the screen lights up, the operating system boots. It's incredibly clean. I mean, it's binary. The machine either has power flowing to it or it doesn't.
Oh, absolutely. It's this entirely invisible baseline for most people. Like, we completely take the underlying physics and, frankly, the economics of that power for granted when we're, opening applications or running software or just browsing the web.
Yeah, as long as your device is plugged into the wall, you never actually have to think about the complex, continent-spanning plumbing of electricity that makes your digital world possible.
Yeah, until it's not there.
Right. But then you turn your attention to the greatest infrastructure and investment challenge on the planet right now, and suddenly that simple power button becomes the most complicated concept in the world.
It really does. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking you on a really extensive journey into Sub-Saharan Africa's dual energy and digital crisis. We're going to explore this region's rapid development, not just as a, traditional infrastructure project, but like a colossal computer system trying to boot up in real time.
Which is such a fascinating way to frame it.
It is, and we have a towering stack of sources today. We're looking at reports from the African Development Bank, the World Bank, the Global Solar Council, plus these exhaustive telecom industry analyses and the African Economic Outlook. Our mission is to basically synthesize all of this for you.
And, looking at this challenge as a computer system is genuinely the most effective way to grasp the sheer scale of what is actually happening. We are witnessing a historic paradigm shift right now.
Mm-hmm.
For decades, the prevailing model was based on centralized, state-led power grids, big, bulky, bureaucratic infrastructure. But that legacy model is failing under its own weight, and it's being rapidly replaced by a decentralized, digitally integrated frontier. It's a fundamental rewrite of the region's code. So to make sense of this massive stack of research, we're going to break it down into a stack of 3 interconnected layers. First, we will look at layer 1, the baseline, which is the infrastructure operating system.
The hardware, essentially.
Right, the hardware. Then we'll move up to layer 2, the stunting effect, which we are calling the human compute layer. And finally, layer 3, the innovation ceiling, which is the application layer.
The digital stuff.
Exactly. But before we can even begin to boot up this analysis, we need the right analytical lenses. Because, if you look at a continent of 54 distinct nations as a single, uniform monolith, you are going to misinterpret the data completely. The sources are incredibly strict about these methodology guardrails.
They absolutely are. You just cannot treat the African energy landscape as one cohesive entity. The data requires us to divide the continent into 3 distinct archetypes to really understand what is actually happening on the ground.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's walk through those archetypes because they set the stage for everything else. What is archetype 1?
So archetype 1 is what the researchers classify as industrialized but strained.
Okay.
The prime example here is South Africa. Now, this archetype has high traditional grid penetration. Millions of people and businesses are wired into the system, but that system is plagued by severe structural decay and aging infrastructure.
Right. They've had the grid for a long time.
Exactly. And the national utility, Eskom, is burdened with staggering debt. A really defining characteristic of this archetype is an over-reliance on legacy fuels. Coal makes up about 81% of their energy mix.
Wow. 81%?
Yeah. And because the infrastructure is old and poorly maintained, the system suffers from severe rolling blackouts, which they refer to as load shedding. So they have the physical grid, but the operating system is constantly crashing.
So that's the strained legacy system. You have the wires, but absolutely no reliability. Then we move to archetype 2. Which feels functionally like a different universe.
It really is. Archetype 2 is decentralized and leapfrogging. Think of countries like Kenya and Rwanda. Here, traditional centralized grid access might be significantly lower, particularly when you move outside the major urban centers. But the population isn't just sitting around waiting for state utility poles to reach their villages. They are rapidly deploying market-led, decentralized solutions. We're talking about pay-as-you-go or pay-go solar systems.
I want to pause on pay-go for a second because the mechanism behind it is just fascinating. It's not just buying a solar panel at a hardware store. It's an entire Internet of Things ecosystem, isn't it?
It is an incredible technological marriage. So the way PayBogo works is that a customer receives a solar panel and a battery unit for their home with a very low upfront cost. And inside that battery unit is a cellular SIM card, just like the one in your smartphone.
Wait, really? The battery has a SIM card?
Yes. The battery is connected to the telecom network. The user sends a micropayment, maybe just 50 cents via SMS, using a mobile money platform. Right, so the telecom network receives the payment, pings the SIM card inside the solar battery, and digitally unlocks the power for 24 hours. It perfectly combines digital financial plumbing with distributed renewable energy. They are effectively leapfrogging the 20th century utility grid model entirely.
That blows my mind every time I think about it. You literally text your house to turn the lights on.
It's exactly that.
But then we have to confront the hardest reality, which is archetype 3.
Yes. Archetype 3 is classified as severely constrained. These are nations like Burundi, where national grid access is sitting at a mere 11.6%, Chad at 12%, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is below 20%.
That's incredibly low.
It is. These regions rely heavily on ultra-expensive, highly fragmented fossil fuel generators. The regulatory frameworks are practically non-existent, and the sheer capital required to keep isolated diesel generators running makes economic scaling incredibly difficult.
So keeping those 3 distinct archetypes in mind is our first methodology guardrail. But there's a second guardrail the sources aggressively insist on, and that is avoiding the binary fallacy. We have to stop asking the simplistic question, do they have power or not?
The binary access versus no access metric is fundamentally broken. I mean, the research relies instead on the SE4All multi-tier framework, or MTF.
Right.
This framework demands that we evaluate energy access as a spectrum. It measures capacity, duration, reliability, affordability, and safety. It ranges from Tier 0, which is total energy poverty, up through incremental steps all the way to Tier 5, which represents a full, reliable 257 grid equivalent.
Okay, let's unpack this further with our digital analogy. Evaluating energy access as a simple yes or no is exactly like asking if someone has internet access. Technically speaking, having a faint 2G signal on a cracked smartphone that drops the connection every 5 minutes is, internet access. But functionally, economically, it is an entirely different reality than sitting in an office with a stable gigabit fiber optic connection.
Totally different.
Right. If you only have Tier 1 power, which might be just enough capacity to charge a mobile phone and run 2 LED bulbs for 4 hours a day, you can't run a commercial refrigerator. You can't power a manufacturing lathe. You cannot boot up a localized economy.
That is a perfect translation of the concept. The tiered framework forces policymakers to completely rethink the investment gap. It's not simply about stringing a wire to a house and checking a box on a development goal. It's about what that specific tier of power can actually support.
Yeah.
Can you build a business on it? Can you run life-saving medical equipment on it? If the answer is no, then the access is merely statistical, not structural.
So, with our 3 archetypes established and our multi-tier lens firmly in place, let's descend to layer 1 of our stack, the baseline, the infrastructure OS. These are the structural rules of the game. We need to examine exactly why the old centralized system is breaking down.
And it is breaking down in very specific ways.
Exactly. The underlying numbers here really define the scope of the problem. Sub-Saharan Africa is home to nearly 600 million people who completely lack electricity. That represents 83% of the entire global electricity deficit.
It is an immense hardware deficit. And to understand why the traditional state-led electrification model has failed to close that 600 million person gap, we really have to look at the economic engine of the utilities themselves. There are 3 primary economic bottlenecks crippling these grids.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is what economists call the subsidy trap. Throughout the continent, governments heavily subsidize electricity tariffs to keep the cost artificially low for citizens. As of the data from 2024, only 12 African countries actually enforce cost-reflective pricing.
Wow.
That means in the vast majority of nations, the state utility does not charge the consumer enough to cover the actual cost of generating and distributing the power.
I mean, I understand the political pressure to do that.
Yeah.
No politician wants to run on a platform of quadrupling the electricity bill. But how does that actually impact the infrastructure long term?
It creates a slow-motion collapse. Take Senegal as a case study. In 2022, energy subsidies drained roughly 5% of their entire gross domestic product.
5% of GDP just on energy subsidies.
Just on subsidies. That is an immense fiscal hemorrhage. When the utility is forced to sell power at a loss, they have zero capital left over to maintain the existing grid, buy replacement transformers, or extend wires to new unconnected populations.
That makes sense. It's a negative feedback loop.
Exactly. And that bleeds directly into the second bottleneck, utility insolvency. Across the continent, grids suffer from incredibly high technical and commercial losses.
Let's define those terms for a second. Technical losses mean the physical infrastructure is degrading power, is literally dissipating as heat from old wires and blown transformers. And commercial losses mean the power arrives, but it's stolen, or the metering is broken, or the bills simply aren't collected.
Precisely. Those combined losses average 15% across the continent, but the data shows they peak at a staggering 40% in places like Guinea. Yeah, think about the unit economics of that. When a utility is losing 40% of its product before it even had the chance to issue an invoice, and the remaining 60% is sold below cost due to subsidies, that utility operates at a profound loss.
Right.
An insolvent utility is completely unbankable. Private investors, pension funds, international banks, they are not going to finance a grid expansion if the core business model is a leaky bucket.
Wait, I have to jump in here. If a state utility is trapped by political subsidies, physically leaking power, and losing 40% of its revenue to theft or bad metering, why would global institutions keep pouring money into that model? It sounds financially suicidal.
And that is exactly the realization the global financial community has finally arrived at, which we will get to in a moment. But before we look at the solution, we have to understand the third bottleneck, which is arguably the most volatile: currency volatility, the macroeconomic shock.
I found this part of the research fascinating because it bridges engineering with global finance. How does foreign exchange break a local power grid?
It exposes a fatal mismatch in the system's architecture. State power grids buy their heavy equipment, the turbines, the high-voltage transformers, the specialized spare parts on the global market. Those contracts are priced in US dollars or euros.
Okay.
But the utility collects its revenue from local citizens in the local currency.
So they are incredibly exposed to the exchange rate. If the local currency drops, their operational costs skyrocket overnight, even if the actual physical grid hasn't changed at all.
We saw a devastating real-world example of this in 2024 with the Ethiopian birr. The government made a macroeconomic policy shift to a market-based exchange rate, and the birr devalued by over 50% against the US dollar almost immediately.
That's a massive shock.
It is. Think about the utility director in Addis Ababa. Yesterday, a replacement part from Germany cost a certain amount in birr. Today, that exact same part costs twice as much. Suddenly, importing spare parts became entirely unaffordable. Because of that sudden currency shock, 25% of Ethiopia's installed power capacity was left completely inactive.
Wait, a quarter of their power generation just went offline.
Yes. The physical infrastructure was built, the water was in the dams, but the macroeconomic reality prevented them from turning the turbines on.
That is a terrifying vulnerability. Your entire national operating system can crash because of a currency trader in London.
Literally.
So to answer my own previous question, we have bankrupt utilities, highline losses, and extreme currency exposure. The traditional grid model is fundamentally stuck. How on earth do you fix a 600 million person deficit with that broken machinery?
You don't, you bypass it. And this is where the macro policy response is shifting gears in a historic way. You cannot keep forcing capital into a broken model. This realization is the catalyst for Mission 300.
Mission 300. The sources bring this up repeatedly. It sounds like a moonshot.
It is arguably the most ambitious electrification effort ever attempted. It's a joint initiative launched by the World Bank Group and the African Development Bank with a singular mandate: connect 300 million Africans to reliable electricity by the year 2030.
That's half the deficit.
Exactly. They're attempting to cut the continent's power deficit in half in just a handful of years. The World Bank alone has committed $30 billion to this initiative. But the research estimates the total sector investment required from private and public sources will be around $200 billion a year.
But they aren't just writing a $30 billion check to the insolvent state utilities, right? How does Mission 300 actually deploy that capital without it disappearing into the subsidy trap?
This is the critical pivot. Roughly half of that 300 million target relies on distributed renewable energy, or DRE, and off-grid solutions.
Like the PA-GOCO systems we talked about.
Exactly. They are bypassing the broken legacy operating systems by directly funding decentralized solar arrays, independent mini-grids, and those PA-GO systems. They're funding infrastructure that never touches the central utility's balance sheet.
Okay, that makes sense for rural areas. But what about the centralized grids? They can't just abandon the cities and the heavy industries. The sources detail the strategy for the legacy systems called regional power pools.
Right. If you have a collection of fragmented, financially struggling national grids, the logical engineering solution is to physically link them together. You create cross-border transmission lines so countries can share excess capacity. If one country has a surplus of hydropower on a Tuesday and a neighboring country is experiencing a deficit, they trade.
Oh, interesting.
The Southern African Power Pool, or SAPP, is the most advanced example of this. They have actually structured day-ahead and intraday trading markets.
For the listener who doesn't trade commodities, what is a day-ahead market in the context of electricity?
It's a financial and operational mechanism where power producers and consumers calculate their expected demand for tomorrow. For instance, a utility might look at the weather forecast, see a heat wave coming, and know they will need an extra 500 megawatts of power tomorrow afternoon. They go to the power pool market today, place a bid, and secure a contract for a neighboring country to deliver that exact amount of power tomorrow. It brings immense stability and market efficiency to the grid.
In theory, that sounds incredibly robust. But the data shows it's struggling.
It is. As we discussed with Archetype 1, the SAPP relies heavily on aging infrastructure. Furthermore, they are highly dependent on hydroelectric power in places like Zambia and Zimbabwe. Severe El Niño-linked droughts have drastically lowered water levels in the dams, physically crippling their ability to generate power to sell into that pool.
And then there's the West African Power Pool, WAPP. The reports noted they achieved a monumental milestone in 2023. They physically synchronized 12 national grids. That is a staggering engineering feat to get 12 different sovereign power systems to oscillate at the exact same frequency.
Brilliant.
But the utilization numbers were shocking. They were only utilizing about 25% of that cross-border capacity. Why spend billions building international transmission lines if you aren't going to send power down them?
It comes down to regulatory friction. The physical hardware, the copper and the steel is connected, but the legal and economic rules governing them are entirely mismatched. The African Development Bank maintains an index called the Electricity Regulatory Index, the ERI. It highlights how outdated regulatory frameworks across the continent historically protect the state monopoly and actively penalize independent power producers, or IPPs.
I see. If I'm an independent company wanting to build a massive solar farm in one country and sell it across the border, the state utility views me as a threat, not a partner.
Exactly. There is a desperate need for clear, harmonized regulations across borders. If you want to attract private capital to build out these power pools, investors need absolute certainty. They need to know what the tariff rules are, what the licensing procedures look like, and they need cast iron assurance that the national energy regulator is truly independent from political interference.
Right.
Without that regulatory software update, the physical hardware of the power pools will remain severely underutilized.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we step back and look at layer 1, the baseline OS is fundamentally strained. It is burdened by legacy debt, highly vulnerable to currency shocks, and throttled by regulatory friction. But it is slowly being bypassed and rewritten by massive decentralized initiatives like Mission 300.
That's a great summary.
Now, a broken operating system means the software cannot run properly. And in our framework, the software is human potential and economic productivity. Let's move up to layer 2, the stunting effect, which we're calling the human compute layer. Because when the power grid fails, the economy doesn't just stop and wait patiently. It adapts.
Yes, very painfully.
Yeah, it adapts in incredibly inefficient, painful, and expensive ways. Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to talk about what the sources call the diesel tax on enterprise.
It is a profound way to frame the economic reality. The research describes the exorbitant cost of self-provisioning energy as an informal taxation. When a small or medium enterprise, an SME, cannot rely on the state grid, they don't simply close up shop and go home. They go out and buy a diesel generator.
But the unit economics of that are brutal. The data shows that businesses in many of these regions face an average of 8 unpredictable power outages a month. So they have to run these local generators constantly to maintain any semblance of uptime. And purchasing diesel by the liter to run a small generator costs 3 to 7 times more than what grid power costs in developed nations.
And beyond the sheer cost, it leaves these local businesses highly exposed to global fuel shocks. Look at Nigeria in 2023. The new government administration made the difficult macroeconomic decision to remove domestic fuel subsidies. Almost immediately, the price of diesel at the pump surged by 200% within a single year.
That's devastating.
Imagine you run a medium-sized cold storage logistics company or a local manufacturing shop. Your primary operational cost just tripled overnight, and you cannot pass a 200% price increase onto your local customers.
No, they wouldn't be able to afford it.
Right, that profit margin vanishes. That is capital that should have been deployed to hire more workers, expand inventory, or invest in new digital technology. Instead, that capital is literally being combusted in a noisy machine outback just to keep the lights on. It enforces a hard ceiling on the growth of the entire SME sector.
It is a physical throttle on productivity. But the human compute layer isn't just about businesses and profit margins. It is about fundamental human development and survival. Let's look at the UNESCO and World Health Organization data on healthcare downtime. This is where the lack of an operating system becomes an immediate matter of life and death.
Yes, the numbers here are really grim.
They're chilling. 15% of clinics in Sub-Saharan Africa have absolutely zero access to power, and only 50% of hospitals have what is classified as reliable power.
We have to ask, what does a medical facility actually look like when it loses power? It means vaccine cold chains fail. Life-saving immunizations that require strict temperature control are ruined. It means essential diagnostic equipment, blood centrifuges, ultrasound machines cannot be powered on.
It's awful.
It means that if an emergency surgery needs to happen after sundown, it is being performed by the light of a kerosene lantern or a mobile phone flashlight.
But what struck me in the reports is that they also map out a highly achievable, highly specific solution here. We aren't talking about waiting decades for the national grid to reach these rural clinics.
No, not at all. And the required capital is surprisingly modest in the grand scheme of global development. A targeted investment of just 484 million euros into decentralized solar and battery backup systems could independently electrify 50,000 rural clinics across the continent.
Just under 500 million euros.
Exactly. And the ripple effect of that specific investment is immense, because those local rural clinics would finally be fully operational, capable of storing vaccines and running diagnostics. It would drastically alter human movement. It is estimated it would reduce travel times for 281 million people by an average of 50 minutes.
Let's make that tangible. A mother with a sick child wouldn't have to bypass her local unpowered clinic and walk or catch a bus for an extra hour to reach a distant, grid-connected urban hospital just to get basic medical care.
Exactly.
484 million euros to give 281 million people an hour of their lives back during moments of severe medical distress. That is an incredible return on investment, and we see this stunting effect hit just as severely in education. The statistics here are heavy. 217 million primary school children lack power at home or at school. The learning poverty rate averages 87%. Walk us through the direct correlation between the energy deficit and learning capacity.
It connects directly to the concept of human compute capacity. Without light, studying strictly stops at sunset. You cannot read a textbook in the dark.
Right.
If a family attempts to extend the day by relying on kerosene lamps, they are introducing severe indoor air pollution, respiratory issues, and significant fire hazards into the home. The sources note that the simple provision of clean, reliable solar lighting, just a Tier 1 or Tier 2 PAGO system, gives girls an estimated extra 0.65 years of schooling and boys an extra 0.41 years.
Over the course of a childhood, that compounds into a vast intellectual advantage. And it doesn't just affect the students, it severely impacts the educational infrastructure itself.
Crucially, yes. In rural Kenya, surveys show that 60% of head teachers report that the lack of electricity is the primary factor preventing them from recruiting and retaining qualified staff.
Wow, 60%?
Yeah. Teachers do not want to relocate to remote areas without power. If a teacher has to travel for an hour on a weekend just to reach a regional town with a reliable grid so they can print test papers or download lesson plans, they will eventually leave. You cannot build a modern educational foundation without basic power access.
We also have to discuss the concept of time poverty. When a community lacks power, the necessary energy doesn't just magically appear. It requires human labor to procure. Millions of hours are lost daily, disproportionately shouldered by women and youth just manually sourcing energy, walking miles to gather firewood, or traveling to a distant market to purchase kerosene.
It's an invisible tax on their time.
Right. That is billions of hours of human compute capacity, of potential entrepreneurial innovation or study time that is simply deleted from the economy every single day.
It is a compounding multi-generational deficit. When you starve the human layer of time, of healthcare, and of education, you are fundamentally throttling the capacity of the future workforce.
Exactly. So let's trace the causality up the stack. If the baseline OS is broken and the human compute layer is physically and intellectually stunted, the technological layer above it hits a hard, immovable ceiling. We cannot foster a digital revolution without power. Which brings us to layer 3, the innovation and delivery ceiling, or the application layer.
The digital layer.
Right. And there is a profound contradiction in the source material here that really grabbed my attention. The data shows that 3G mobile coverage across Africa is actually incredibly high. It sits at 92.5%. The signal is physically there. But there is a massive usage gap of 960 million people.
Yes, almost a billion people.
Nearly a billion people live within range of a mobile broadband network, but they remain entirely unconnected to the internet. Why? If the 3G signal is floating right through their living room, why aren't they logging on?
It comes down to two immense barriers: affordability and battery anxiety. And if you trace the root cause, both are direct symptoms of the energy deficit. Let's analyze affordability first. We know that telecom operators have to build thousands of cell towers to provide that 92.5% geographic coverage.
Sure.
But because the national grid is unreliable or completely non-existent in rural areas, those telecom operators have to generate the power for the towers themselves.
Right. They're forced to become decentralized energy companies by default, rather than just data providers.
Exactly. And historically, they power those remote towers with diesel generators. The operational logistics are staggering. Energy accounts for up to 60% of a telecom operator's off-grid tower operating costs.
60%.
In Nigeria alone, telecom companies burn through $400 million a year purely on diesel fuel to keep the network active. Those immense operational costs don't just vanish into the ether. They are passed directly down the value chain to the consumer in the form of high data prices.
Okay, let's unpack this. So it is the exact same diesel tax that crushes the small businesses, but this time it's levying a toll on the digital economy.
That is precisely what it is. Because of that embedded energy cost, in countries like the DRC, Tanzania, and Uganda, basic entry-level data plans cost between 4.6% and 10.3% of the gross national income per capita.
That's huge.
It is. The global target for internet affordability set by international bodies is 2%. So data is functionally transformed from a basic utility into a luxury good for the majority of the population.
I want to try an analogy here to visualize this. It is like the telecom operators have built these incredible high-tech digital lighthouses all along the coast to guide maritime traffic. But because there is no central power grid to plug the lighthouses into, each lighthouse operator is forced to build their own miniature oil refinery right next to the tower just to keep the light spinning.
I love that analogy.
And because refining their own oil in isolation is so insanely expensive, they have to charge a massive toll to any local boat that wants to use the shipping route. So the local boats, the citizens, look at the toll, realize they can't afford it, and just stay in the harbor.
That is a brilliant visualization of the economic friction. The digital infrastructure is physically present, but the underlying energy economics make it practically inaccessible. And the tragedy is, even if a user can scrape together the money to afford the data plan, they immediately run into the second barrier: battery anxiety.
Walk us through battery anxiety. How does a lack of power change human interaction with technology?
If you live in a Tier 1 or Tier 2 energy environment, you might only have a few hours of electricity a day at home to charge your smartphone. Or you might have to walk to a local kiosk and pay a fee to charge it. As a result, user behavior fundamentally alters. People routinely switch their smartphones to airplane mode or power them down completely for the majority of the day, strictly to preserve battery life.
Because if the phone dies, they are entirely cut off. They lose access to their mobile money, their emergency contacts, their business network, so they hoard their battery life like rations.
Yes. And from an application layer perspective, this behavioral adaptation is devastating. Modern tech platforms, local app developers, digital services, they all base their survival and valuation on DAU, daily active user metrics, or MAU, monthly active users.
Right. If you're not online, you're not an active user.
Exactly. If your target demographic is offline for 20 hours a day just to save battery, you cannot build a sticky, sustainable digital platform. You cannot run targeted advertising. You cannot offer real-time ride-sharing or on-demand delivery. The underlying energy deficit actively destroys the engagement metrics required to sustain local digital ecosystems.
It is an invisible systemic ceiling on innovation. But the telecom operators are not just accepting this fate. There's a profound shift happening in the industry right now.
Mm.
They're looking at their balance sheets, realizing that burning $400 million of diesel a year is economically insane, and they are pivoting hard.
It is a critical transition, and it's happening rapidly. We are seeing major Tier 1 operators like Orange and MTN aggressively shifting to hybrid solar and battery systems to power their towers. Safaricom, the dominant player in Kenya, actually went to the market and raised a $153.6 million green bond.
For the listener who might not be familiar with corporate finance, what exactly is a green bond?
A green bond is a type of fixed-income financial instrument designed specifically to support specific climate-related or environmental projects. Because the funds are strictly earmarked for green initiatives, in this case, transitioning their telecom tower network off fossil fuels and onto solar power, Safaricom can attract investment from global climate funds, often at more favorable interest rates than standard corporate debt.
Ah, clever.
And the operational results are immediate. Early data from deployments in extremely challenging environments like South Sudan show that retrofitting a tower with solar cuts fuel spending by roughly 30% right out of the gate.
But there is another layer to this infrastructure shift that is even more structural than just swapping a diesel engine for a solar panel. It's changing who actually owns and operates the tower itself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you are looking at the rapid rise of independent tower companies, or towercos, and the adoption of passive infrastructure sharing. Historically, a mobile operator like Vodafone or MTN would acquire land, pour the concrete, build the steel tower, and maintain the power supply entirely on their own. It was a proprietary asset.
Right.
But as the industry has matured, they realized a fundamental truth. Their core business is routing data and acquiring customers, not pouring concrete and maintaining diesel generators.
They just need a high place to bolt their antenna.
Precisely. So we are witnessing a vast divestiture of assets. Currently, 44% of African cell towers are no longer owned by the telecoms, but are run by independent towercos.
Okay.
These are specialized infrastructure companies. Their entire business model is building a tower, securing the energy supply increasingly through high-efficiency solar and lithium-ion batteries, and then leasing space on that single piece of steel to 2, 3, or even 4 competing mobile operators simultaneously.
I want to challenge this for a second. On one hand, that sounds incredibly efficient for capital. If 3 operators share one tower, that is 2 towers that didn't have to be built, and 2 diesel generators that aren't polluting the air. But aren't we just trading one problem for another?
How do you mean?
Like, if independent towercos consolidate all the rural infrastructure, aren't we just trading a bloated, inefficient state energy monopoly for a highly consolidated private telecom infrastructure monopoly? Could a dominant towerco just squeeze the mobile operators on lease prices?
That is a highly astute critique, and it is a risk that regulators are actively monitoring. However, the current econometric data from the sources suggests the efficiency gains far outweigh the consolidation risks at this stage of development. For the mobile network operators, this divestiture is vital for survival. By shedding the heavy, continuous capital expenditure of building and powering physical towers, they suddenly free up their balance sheets. They can redirect that capital to invest in the actual network technology rolling out 4G and 5G spectrum, expanding rural reach, and theoretically lowering data prices for the end consumer, which directly helps close that 960 million person usage gap.
Have we actually seen data prices drop?
We have. The data clearly shows that countries with a higher market share of independent towercos experience measurably better 4G coverage, faster network speeds, and lower data prices as a percentage of income. The shared efficiency is currently being passed down.
Okay, so independent infrastructure sharing and solar-powered towers are beginning to solve the rural and mobile connectivity issue. But there is a final boss in the application layer, and that is the data centers. We keep hearing about the AI revolution, the expansion of cloud computing, edge networks.
Yeah.
You cannot run a modern, sophisticated digital economy solely on smartphones. You need server racks.
Yeah.
You need data centers.
And this brings us to the data center conundrum. Modern digital transformation, especially the deployment of 5G networks and artificial intelligence, requires localized cloud infrastructure. You need edge compute. You need the data to be processed physically close to the user to reduce latency, the delay between sending a command and receiving a response.
Right.
But there is an uncompromising physical reality. Tier 3 and Tier 4 data centers require hyper-reliable megawatt-scale power.
Let's define those tiers briefly. What makes a data center Tier 4?
Data center classifications are all about guaranteed uptime. A Tier 4 facility is enterprise class. It has fully redundant power feeds, backup generators, and N+1 cooling systems. It is engineered to guarantee 99.995% uptime.
Wow.
They cannot experience even a millisecond of power fluctuation without risking catastrophic data corruption.
Which is a remarkably tall order when the national grid outside the building is dropping 15% of its power on a good day and experiencing 8 outages a month.
Exactly. Because of that severe grid instability, these immense technological investments are physically bottlenecked. You cannot power a 20-megawatt Tier 4 AI data center with a patchwork of diesel generators and rooftop solar. You need a robust, industrial-scale grid.
And because that grid is lacking, they just cluster in the safe zones.
Precisely. These facilities are being forced to cluster only in the few stable regions on the continent, primarily in Archetype 1 environments like South Africa or very specific, highly developed coastal hubs. This clustering leaves the vast majority of the continent reliant on distant, high-latency computing hosted thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
You simply cannot host an autonomous vehicle network or a real-time AI revolution on a grid that crashes twice a week.
It all cascades back down the stack.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. If we trace the causality, it is perfectly clear. To fix the application layer, to lower those exorbitant data costs, cure the battery anxiety that kills digital platforms, and attract the hyperscale data centers necessary for an AI economy, you absolutely have to fix the human compute layer first.
Exactly.
You have to free those small and medium enterprises from the crushing diesel tax so they have the capital to afford digital services. You have to keep the lights on in the primary schools so the next generation can actually learn to write the code. But none of that human potential can be unlocked without fundamentally fixing the infrastructure OS at the very bottom.
Yes.
You have to transition away from the centralized, debt-ridden, coal and diesel legacy grids and move aggressively toward the solutions we've discussed. Decentralized solar arrays, mobile money integrated mini-grids, and capital-efficient infrastructure sharing.
It is an entirely integrated challenge. You cannot solve the digital divide in isolation without solving the energy deficit. And increasingly, you cannot solve the energy deficit without the digital tools like mobile money to finance it.
And for you listening to this, wherever you are in the world, I want to emphasize that this is not just a distant story about the African continent catching up to the West. It is much more profound than that. Sub-Saharan Africa is currently operating as a vast, real-time laboratory for the future of decentralized infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Understanding this integrated frontier, this incredible blend of decentralized pay-as-you-go solar hardware running on digital mobile money plumbing, is a masterclass in building true resilience. Because they are forced to operate outside the legacy grid, they are creating systems that are designed from the ground up to be resilient against global supply chain shocks, currency volatility, and central point failures. That is precisely the kind of decentralized architecture and knowledge that the rest of the world is going to desperately need as legacy grids in Europe and North America begin to age, falter, and strain under the dual demands of extreme climate change and power-hungry AI data centers. So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive talking about a computer system, the binary expectation of pressing a power button. The infrastructure operating system in Africa hasn't just been rebooted, it is being entirely rewritten with resilient, decentralized code.
It's an incredible transformation to witness.
And here's a final thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends. Africa currently possesses the youngest, fastest-growing population on Earth. Millions of young minds are coming of age in this uniquely challenging, highly adaptive environment. If massive macro initiatives like Mission 300 actually hit their targets and 300 million people suddenly gain reliable, cheap, Tier 2 or Tier 3 uptime via decentralized solar, completely unburdened by the bulky, monopolistic fossil fuel grids that tie down the Western world, what kinds of entirely new digital industries, applications, and tech giants will this newly unlocked human capital build? What does a digital economy actually look like when it is born natively on distributed solar power and digital mobile money? The rest of the world probably isn't even anticipating the kind of innovation that is about to come online.